Hi everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism and narcissistic relationships and just toxic stuff in general. So, have any of you ever had self-care be shamed? We live in a world where everyone's like, self-care, self-care. Well, have in your narcissistic relationship were you taught that was a bad thing? Share your thoughts on that in the comments, because I know somewhere along the line of being in a narcissistic relationship, I was taught that self-care was a bad thing. I personally am not a big fan of the term self-care. It sounds a little bit too much, go to the spa, light candles, take a bath, brief respite, before you have to throw yourself back into some toxic spaces in your life. But when you really use the term right, it's not just spa stuff. Self-care is about being responsive to yourself, giving yourself a break when you're having a tough day, nourishing yourself, and simply just being aware of what you need and giving that to yourself. It may be like taking a break, putting stuff down and saying, you know what, I'm going to take a nap. The loss of self-care is a standard experience for anyone in a narcissistic relationship. And it's unfortunate, because if there was ever a group of people that require self-care, it is people in these kinds of toxic relationships. In a way, self-care would be the only way to survive. So one would wonder, what happens? How do narcissistic relationships erode self-care? First, narcissistic people will shame your self-care, though they take pretty damn good care of themselves. The vast majority of people I have worked with throughout my career, and it doesn't matter what kind of relationship it was, parent, partner, work, other family, have said without exception that if they were caught engaging in self-care, that they were called selfish, self-indulgent, or it was those things were quietly implied with passive-aggressive remarks like, oh, wow, you must not be working that hard. Do you really have time for that? Or, did you actually get done all the stuff you said you were going to get done? Or, oh, is that really how you're going to spend your money? Or even, wow, is it really any wonder you don't get anything done if you're just sitting around? Whatever dig they get in, narcissistic relationships in general are a place where your needs go to die. Your needs, not theirs. This is really unfortunate if this originates in childhood, because engaging in anything that resembles self-care can feel impossible when you reach adulthood. You may see a parent doing it, but yet everyone else would be shamed for engaging in it. Narcissistic relationships are places where your needs are secondary and even shameful. So to actually do what you need to be and feel healthy, to be responsive to yourself, well, that flies in the face of the premise of the narcissistic relationship. Now, if you find hidden ways of caring for yourself, that could work. But that's not how it's supposed to work. Self-care shouldn't be a shame, like a sort of the idea of you sort of taking care of your needs on the sly, as though your needs are somehow shameful, feels like the equivalent of sneaking behind the building and sneaking a cigarette. But the implicit message is the sort of Cinderella of it all. You can go to the ball if you take care of every single thing around here and make our dresses and make sure we look good, and then maybe you can go, but we're going to sabotage you at the end anyhow. That's what self-care pursuits look like in a narcissistic relationship. Only if all of their needs are met, you do everything they say, the house is perfect, the work is perfectly done, everything is just right. Then and only then could you even ponder doing something you need for you. Otherwise, you are being selfish. And even then, they may sabotage what you set up for yourself or the time you need to do what you need. Here's the thing, self-care on a schedule doesn't always work. You don't always know when you're going to need a minute to gather yourself. Sure, it certainly is nice, and it's actually a good thing to schedule something pleasurable. But odds are that that massage isn't always going to fall on the day you need it. And on that day, when you feel invalidated, or you had a negative interaction, or just a bad day, or were really gaslighted, sometimes you need a minute. And that needing a minute is what often gets pathologized in a narcissistic relationship. Doubly awful is that the narcissistic people will always take the time they need for themselves, and then some. I think this idea of self-care as a luxury needs to be halted, and instead, self-care doesn't need to take hours, but it simply may be the few minutes you give yourself after a particularly bad day or after reading a really uncomfortable email. The night you opt to not cook or let the laundry go so you can get some rest. It's recognizing that you don't need to be superhuman, and sometimes you just have human needs. Narcissistic relationships push us to be perfectionistic robots. The idea that maybe there is a point of enough where we will get it right and they'll be okay with us and then we can breathe. That moment doesn't exist, and there's no such thing as perfect, and we are not robots. We are people who, in many cases, after years of toxic relationships, need a minute more than anyone else to realign, to fall out of negative mindsets, to be kind to ourselves. The shaming of self-care over the course of a narcissistic relationship can mean that a person can get very burned out and put themselves at risk for depression or physical health issues. So many people want the humanity of the narcissistic person to come out, for them to wake up one day and want us to engage in self-care or support our self-care. It typically doesn't happen. But even more terribly, a legacy is that people in these relationships never really learn how to do it for themselves. This isn't about resorts, like I said, and candlelit bathtubs. This is about survival, about being responsive to your own fatigue, your own emotions and experiences. There is no enough with them. And if you remain in one of these relationships, you just have to recognize that what you do for yourself will be critiqued and shamed. And if you decide to leave one of these relationships, recognize that learning self-care in a meaningful, responsive way will actually not be that easy. In early days, you may feel guilty when you engage in self-care. The internalized voice of the narcissistic person in your life still ringing through, especially if they're still in your life. But over time, just as you wouldn't walk on a broken leg or drive on a flat tire, you would fix those things first. It's the same with us. Sometimes we as people, human beings, need a minute. The guilt, yeah, it's going to be uncomfortable. But tolerate it as you try to get to the other side and give yourself what you need, even if it is just a minute. Self-care is really, really complicated, and it's a very two-sided, sort of two sides out of the same mouth. Narcissistic people make sure they've got their golf game scheduled, and they're this scheduled, and they're that scheduled. But because other human beings are often viewed as functionaries in their lives, you would be quite surprised if your coffee maker walked off the counter and decided to go off to get a massage and get its hair done. It's a coffee maker. Its job is to make your coffee. It's a thing. Well, when you recognize that that's how the narcissistic person views you, and would almost recognize with the same absurdity, well, what are you doing just walking off and taking care of yourself? Either you will be looked at in a perplexed manner, or even when you take those little moments for yourself, feet up, taking a moment, and having that shamed, it can be really, really difficult to give yourself the time and space to actually do this for yourself without feeling guilty. But it's a really, really important thing to learn as part of your healing. Thanks again.